Northern Idaho Panhandle, October 1952. When Thomas Brennan began bolting curved steel panels to the outside of his perfectly good log cabin, his neighbors didn't just question his judgment, they questioned his sanity. Here was a man with a solid homestead, a cabin that had survived 3 winters without major problems, and he was wrapping it in what looked like half of an old grain silo. The ridicule started immediately. At the general store, men shook their heads. Women whispered concerns to his wife. Even the children seemed to understand that something peculiar was happening at the Brennan place. But Thomas hadn't lost his mind. He'd discovered something about heat retention and thermal dynamics that would make his cabin 45 degrees warmer than his neighbors' homes while burning half the firewood. Something so effective that within 3 years, it would change how people built and retrofitted structures across 2 mountain valleys. Before I reveal the engineering principle that transformed a standard frontier cabin into the warmest home in Bonner County, do me a favor. Hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. Do that, and I promise you'll learn a building technique so practical that modern passive house designers are essentially rediscovering what Thomas figured out in 1952. Because what Thomas built wasn't wasteful. It was brilliant. Thomas Brennan wasn't supposed to know anything about advanced building science. He was a timber faller from Oregon who'd moved to Idaho in 1949 with his wife Eleanor and their daughter. He'd built his cabin the way everyone did: notched logs, stone chimney, raised floor, steep roof. It was a good cabin, well constructed, tight by frontier standards. But Thomas had spent the previous winter watching something that bothered him deeply. His cabin was cold. Not freezing, but cold. The fireplace consumed enormous amounts of wood, sometimes 6 cords per winter, and still the temperature in the corners never rose above 52 degrees. The floor was perpetually chilly. Frost formed on the inside of the windows every night. His daughter slept under 3 wool blankets and still complained about the cold. Thomas burned himself out hauling and splitting wood, feeding that hungry fireplace. And for what? A house that was barely comfortable. But the real revelation came in February 1951 when his neighbor, Martin Kellerman, invited him to see something unusual. Kellerman had been corresponding with a friend who'd served in the Pacific Theater during the war, and this friend had sent photographs of Quonset huts. Not just any Quonsets, but ones that had been modified with double walls and insulation for cold weather use in the Aleutian Islands. The photographs showed construction details, measurements, notes about interior temperatures. Kellerman was fascinated by the curved design, but had no plans to build one himself. He just thought it was interesting engineering. Thomas studied those photographs for 2 hours. He asked Kellerman if he could borrow them. For the next 3 months, Thomas kept those images pinned to his workshop wall, staring at them while he worked, thinking about heat flow and surface area, and the way curved shapes might behave differently than flat walls. The problem with his cabin, Thomas realized, wasn't the logs themselves. It was the geometry. Every corner was a cold trap where heat couldn't reach. Every flat wall was a thermal bridge conducting warmth straight through to the freezing air outside. The peaked roof created a massive dead space at the ceiling where heat gathered uselessly before leaking out through gaps in the shingles. His cabin was fighting against basic physics, and physics was winning. What if, Thomas thought, you could eliminate the corners entirely? What if you could create a shape that forced heat to circulate naturally instead of pooling in useless spaces? What if you wrapped the entire structure in a second skin that created an insulating air gap while also shedding wind and weather? In September 1952, Thomas began what his neighbors would call the most wasteful construction project anyone had attempted since the settlement was founded. He wasn't going to tear down his cabin. He was going to build around it. He was going to create a Quonset shell that would encase his entire log structure within a curved, insulated, ventilated envelope. When Eleanor asked if he was sure about this, Thomas showed her the math he'd worked out on paper. The shell would cost them about $180 in materials. If it reduced their wood consumption by even 30%, it would pay for itself in saved labor and fuel within 2 winters. If it worked better than that, they'd be ahead for the rest of their lives. Eleanor, who'd spent the previous winter sleeping in her coat, told him to build it. The design Thomas created was deceptively simple but engineering, sophisticated. He started by surveying his existing cabin, which measured 18 by 26 feet. Then he began setting posts in the ground, forming a larger footprint exactly 4 feet out from each wall. These posts stood 12 feet tall, creating the anchor points for the curved structure that would arc over the cabin like a protective shell. The curve itself was the key innovation. Thomas fabricated the ribs from laminated lumber, thin strips bent and glued into semicircular arcs. He'd learned the technique from boat builders back in Oregon, men who understood that curved wood could be stronger than straight beams if you built it right. Each rib was spaced 2 feet apart, creating a framework that looked like the skeleton of some enormous animal bent over his home. Over these ribs, Thomas began attaching corrugated steel panels, not directly against the wood, but with a 2-inch air gap maintained by wooden spacers. This created the first layer of insulation, a dead air space that would resist heat, transfer far better than solid material alone. Over the steel, he added another layer, sawdust insulation packed between wooden slats, then covered everything with a final skin of cedar shingles. The result was a 4-layer system: the original log cabin walls, then 4 feet of space, then steel, then insulation, then shingles. The gap between the cabin and the shell wasn't empty, wasted space. It was protection, storage, and thermal buffer, all in one. Thomas designed the shell with careful ventilation. Small gaps at ground level on the north side, larger vents near the peak on the south side. This created airflow that would carry moisture away while preventing direct wind penetration. The curved roof extended 5 feet beyond the cabin walls, creating deep eaves that shed snow and rain far from the foundation. Every detail served multiple purposes: weather protection, thermal performance, moisture management, structural integrity. This wasn't a shed thrown up around a cabin. It was an integrated environmental control system disguised as a simple curved shell. His neighbor, Martin Kellerman, watched the construction progress with growing alarm. "Thomas," he said one afternoon in late September, "you're building a second building around your building. That's not insulation, that's redundancy. You've already got a cabin. Why not just add more chinking, maybe some tar paper, beef up the fireplace?" Thomas kept working. "This does more than chinking ever could." Kellerman shook his head. "You're creating a 4-foot dead space around your entire house. That's 4 feet where heat can escape before it even reaches the cabin walls. You'd be better off adding that insulation directly to the logs." Thomas paused, wiping sweat from his forehead. Heat doesn't escape through air unless air is moving. Still air is one of the best insulators there is. That gap creates a buffer zone. Outside air has to pass through the shell, then cross 4 feet of relatively calm air before it touches the cabin. It's like wearing a coat with a loose fit instead of a tight one. The air layer does the work. Kellerman wasn't convinced. And that curved shape? What's that supposed to do besides look strange? "Curves eliminate corners," Thomas said. "Corners trap cold air. Curves force circulation. Heat rises, hits the curved ceiling, flows down the sides, creates a natural convection loop. No dead spots where cold settles. Plus, the curve deflects wind. Flat walls take the full force of wind head on. Curves send it flowing over and around. Less direct pressure means less heat loss." Kellerman crossed his arms. "Thomas, I've built in these mountains for 20 years. I know what works and what doesn't. Heavy logs, tight chinking, big fireplace. That's what keeps you warm. Not curved steel and empty space. You're going to freeze in that thing, and you'll have wasted good money doing it." The criticism spread quickly through the community. At Sunday gatherings, Thomas became the subject of concerned conversations. Benjamin Driscoll, the most respected carpenter in the region, made his opinion clear. Brennan's wrapped his cabin in what amounts to a giant tin can. Metal conducts cold. Doesn't matter how much insulation you pack around it, that steel shell is going to turn his homestead into an icebox. He's made his cabin work harder to stay warm, not easier. An older homesteader named Clarence Webb, who'd survived the brutal winter of 1936, was more blunt. "I've seen men try clever things before. Most of them learned hard lessons. Winter doesn't care about theory. It cares about mass, thickness, and proven methods. That curved shed is going to teach Thomas Brennan a very cold lesson. Even the settlement's minister, Reverend Dale Hutchinson, expressed concern during a visit to the Brennan homestead. "Thomas, I admire your industriousness, but I worry you're putting your family at risk over an experiment. Eleanor and your daughter deserve the security of a proven shelter, not the uncertainty of untested ideas." Thomas kept his response measured. "The cabin is still there, Reverend, still solid, still functional. The shell doesn't replace anything. It just adds protection. If I'm wrong, we're no worse off than before, just out some lumber and steel. If I'm right, we're warmer and using less firewood. Seems like an acceptable risk." But privately, even Thomas had moments of doubt. He'd spent nearly 6 months of labor and a significant portion of their savings on this project. If it failed, if the neighbors were right and the shell actually made things worse, they'd be financially strained and socially humiliated. Every time he looked at the strange, curved structure looming over his cabin, he felt a knot of anxiety. Was he brilliant or foolish? Winter would answer that question with brutal honesty. Thomas finished the shell in early October 1952. The completed structure looked alien in the Idaho landscape, like something from a different world. Where other homesteads showed honest log construction and traditional building methods, the Brennan place looked like a metal cocoon. Children walking past on their way to school would stop and stare. Adults would slow their wagons to get a better look. Everyone had an opinion, and most of those opinions weren't favorable. But Thomas wasn't concerned with appearance. He was concerned with performance, and he'd built something he believed would perform unlike anything the valley had ever seen. If you're fascinated by this story of frontier innovation, hit that like button, subscribe for more forgotten building wisdom, and comment below. What's the coldest temperature you've ever tried to heat a home through? Let's see who's really experienced winter survival. November 1952 began cold. The first snows came early, dusting the mountains white by the second week. Temperatures dropped into the teens at night, rose into the 30s during the day. This was normal Idaho autumn, the prelude to real winter. Thomas fired up his stove for the first time with the shell in place and immediately noticed something different. The cabin warmed faster than before. Within 20 minutes of lighting the fire, the interior temperature had climbed from 48 degrees to 62 degrees. By the time the fire had been burning for an hour, the cabin held a steady 66 degrees. This was unusual. In previous years, it would take 2 hours to bring the cabin to that temperature, and maintaining it required constant feeding of the fire. Now Thomas was using less wood and getting more heat. He checked the shell's ventilation. Air was flowing gently through the gap, just as he'd designed, but not blasting through like a wind tunnel. The curve was deflecting the outside wind, exactly as he'd predicted. His neighbor Martin Kellerman stopped by the following week. "How's the metal icebox treating you?" he asked with a grin. Thomas opened the door. "Come in and see." Kellerman stepped inside and stopped. The cabin was warm, genuinely comfortable. The kind of warm where you didn't notice the temperature because it just felt right. "What's it reading?" Kellerman asked, pointing to the thermometer Thomas had mounted by the door. 64 degrees. Been holding there for 3 hours. Fire's down to coals now. I haven't added wood in 90 minutes. Kellerman frowned. "What's the outside temperature?" Thomas checked the external thermometer mounted on a post outside the shell. 18 degrees, that's a 46-degree difference. Kellerman did the calculation in his head. His own cabin, even with a roaring fire, typically ran about 55 degrees inside when the outside temperature was in the teens. That was a 35 to 37-degree difference. Thomas was maintaining a 46-degree difference with less fire. "How much wood are you burning?" "About a third less than last year so far. And the cabin's warmer." Kellerman walked to the corner of the room and held out his hand. It was the spot where cold air always pooled in log cabins, where the temperature would drop 10 or 15 degrees below the center of the room. He expected to feel the familiar chill. Instead, the temperature felt consistent, no cold spot. He checked the other corners. Same thing. The entire cabin was holding an even temperature. That shouldn't be possible, Kellerman said quietly. Thomas explained what he believed was happening. The shell was creating multiple thermal advantages working together. First, the 4-foot air gap was acting as a massive insulator. Cold outside air had to penetrate the shell, then cross that gap before it could affect the cabin walls. That journey reduced the temperature differential dramatically. Second, the curved shape was forcing air, was circulation inside the cabin. Instead of heat pooling at the ceiling and cold settling in corners, the curve created convection currents that distributed warmth evenly. Third, the shell itself was absorbing wind force, deflecting it up and over rather than allowing it to batter the cabin walls directly. This reduced infiltration and heat loss. Fourth, the shell was creating thermal mass storage in the gap. The air between the cabin and shell warmed during the day from solar gain on the south side and held that warmth through the evening. The cabin wasn't just sitting in cold air anymore. It was sitting in a temperature-buffered zone. Kellerman listened, skeptical but unable to argue with the thermometer. Benjamin Driscoll needs to see this. He's been telling everyone you made a mistake. Maybe I did, Thomas said. Maybe this is all luck, and the real test comes in January. But so far, it's working better than I hoped. By late November, word had spread that something unexpected was happening at the Brennan homestead. Men started stopping by, asking to check the temperature, to see how much wood Thomas was burning, to feel those corners that somehow weren't cold. The evidence was becoming difficult to dismiss. Thomas Brennan's metal cocoon wasn't freezing him out. It was keeping him warmer than anyone else in the valley. But November wasn't winter. November was just the warning. December brought the cold, and December would be the judge that mattered. December 1952 arrived with snow and wind. By the middle of the month, temperatures were consistently below zero at night, climbing only to the single digits during the day. This was real Idaho winter, the kind that found every weakness in every structure. Traditional cabins showed their age. Gaps that seemed tight in summer opened under the stress of expansion and contraction. Chinking cracked. Floors transmitted cold like they were made of ice. Fireplaces consumed wood at terrifying rates, and still the temperature inside most homes barely reached 55 degrees. Benjamin Driscoll's cabin, built with 20 years of expertise, held 56 degrees with constant fire feeding. Clarence Webb's place, constructed by his father in 1919 and maintained meticulously, managed 53 degrees on cold mornings. Martin Kellerman, despite his doubts about Thomas's design, was burning through wood faster than expected and struggling to keep his family comfortable above 50 degrees. Thomas Brennan's cabin, wrapped in its curved shell, held 68 degrees. He was burning approximately half the wood his neighbors used. His fire required feeding every 2 hours instead of every 30 minutes. When he let it die down overnight, the cabin temperature would drop to about 58 degrees by morning, still warmer than most of his neighbors' cabins with fires actively burning. The mathematical reality was becoming impossible to ignore. On December 22nd, Benjamin Driscoll decided to conduct a proper investigation. He arrived at the Brennan homestead with 2 other builders, carrying thermometers and notebooks. "Thomas," Driscoll said, "I need to understand what's happening here. The whole valley is talking about your cabin staying warm with half the wood. I need to see it for myself." Thomas welcomed them in. The interior thermometer read 67 degrees. The external thermometer, mounted outside the shell, read 4 degrees. "That's a 63-degree difference," Driscoll said slowly. "That's not possible with the wood consumption Kellerman says you're using." Thomas showed them his wood stack. He'd been keeping careful records. Since December 1st, he'd burned through approximately 1 cord of wood. Driscoll had burned through 2 1/4 cords in the same period. Thomas walked them through the design, explaining each component. The shell's wind deflection, the thermal buffer of the air gap, the convection circulation from the curved ceiling, the moisture management from the ventilation system, the absence of thermal bridges because the cabin and shell didn't directly contact each other. Driscoll listened, checked the corners for cold spots, examined the shell's construction through the windows, and stood silent for a long time. "This is the opposite of what I predicted," he finally admitted. "I told people that metal shell would conduct cold straight to your cabin, but it's not making contact. There's 4 feet of air between the metal and your walls. The metal is just a windbreak and weather shield. It's not part of the thermal envelope. Thomas nodded. The thermal envelope is the air gap itself. Metal doesn't matter because it's on the outside of the insulation layer, not the inside. One of the other builders, a younger man named Peter Walsh, was examining the ceiling. There's no heat pooling up here. In my cabin, the ceiling space is always 10 to 15 degrees warmer than the floor. This is even top to bottom. The curve does that, Thomas said. Hot air rises but hits the curved surface and gets redirected back down the sides. Creates a circular flow instead of stratification. Walsh shook his head. I've never seen anything like it. You've got a cabin inside a shell, and somehow the shell makes the cabin work completely differently. It's not just warmer, it's fundamentally behaving like a different structure. Driscoll made notes, took measurements, and asked detailed questions for over an hour. When he left, he didn't say Thomas was right, but he didn't say he was wrong either. He just said he needed to think about what he'd seen. The real test came in the first week of January 1953. A cold front swept down from Canada, bringing temperatures that hadn't been seen in the Idaho panhandle in over a decade. On January 8th, the mercury dropped to minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind chill made it feel closer to minus 50. This was survival cold, the kind that killed livestock, froze wells solid, and made people question why they'd ever left warmer climates. Across the valley, families battled to stay alive. Fireplaces were fed constantly. People slept in layers near the hearth. Water froze in buckets indoors. Breath fogged so thick you could barely see across the room. Benjamin Driscoll's cabin, despite his best efforts and decades of experience, couldn't maintain more than 48 degrees. Clarence Webb burned furniture when his wood supply ran low and still couldn't get his home above 44 degrees. Children cried from the cold. Women cooked with numb fingers. Men worked themselves to exhaustion hauling wood and feeding fires that seemed to do nothing against the killing cold pressing in from every direction. Thomas Brennan lit his stove at 6 a.m. on January 8th. By 7:30, his cabin had reached 64 degrees. He added wood every 90 minutes throughout the day. By evening, with the outside temperature at minus 28 and wind howling across the valley, his cabin held 66 degrees. His daughter played on the floor in a light sweater. Eleanor cooked at the stove without wearing a coat. Thomas sat by the window, reading by lamplight, comfortable. The shell was performing exactly as the physics predicted. The curved surface deflected the wind completely. The massive air gap absorbed the cold before it could reach the cabin walls. The even heat distribution meant no cold corners, no floor chill, no suffering. The following morning, Martin Kellerman made the walk to the Brennan place. He'd spent the night feeding his fire every 20 minutes, and his cabin had never risen above 46 degrees. His wife and children had slept in the same bed, huddled together for warmth. When Thomas opened the door, Kellerman just stood there, staring. "Your family is warm. It's not warm at your place?" Thomas asked. Kellerman shook his head. "It's survival. That's all. Just survival. But you're comfortable." Thomas invited him in. Kellerman sat on a chair near the stove and felt warmth soak into him for the first time in days. "How much wood did you burn last night?" "Maybe half what I usually do." "You're at 64 degrees right now. I'm at 46. You're 18 degrees warmer using half the wood. That's a 300% efficiency improvement. That's not a better cabin. That's a completely different category of shelter. Stay with me because what happened next proved the metal shell wasn't a novelty. It was engineering that changed how people survived. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us what you think of this design. Would you build a shell around your cabin? By mid-January, Benjamin Driscoll had started doing something he'd never done in 20 years of building. He was questioning his methods. He visited the Brennan homestead 3 times during the cold snap, each time bringing a different aspect of the design under scrutiny. He measured wood consumption, tracked temperature variations, tested airflow in the gap, examined moisture levels. The data kept pointing to the same conclusion. The shell worked better than anything traditional construction could deliver. On January 18th, Driscoll stood in Thomas's cabin with a notebook full of measurements and admitted what the numbers proved. "You're using 52% less wood than comparable cabins. You're maintaining interior temperatures 15 to 22 degrees warmer depending on conditions. You have zero cold spots, zero moisture problems, and zero structural issues. The shell concept is superior to traditional log construction in every measurable way. Thomas didn't gloat. He'd never been trying to prove anyone wrong. He'd just been trying to keep his family warm. But the proof was undeniable. The design worked. It worked better than expert predictions. It worked better than decades of tradition. It worked because it understood heat behavior instead of just following convention. Word spread through the valley, then to neighboring communities. By late January, people were stopping by just to see the structure, to stand inside and feel the difference. The phrase that kept coming up was, "It doesn't feel like winter in here." That simple statement captured everything. In every other cabin, winter was a constant presence. You fought it, endured it, survived it. In Thomas's cabin, winter was outside, held at bay by 4 feet of air and a curved shell. The psychological difference was as significant as the physical comfort. People living in constant cold develop a kind of resignation. This is just how it is. This is the price of mountain life. But walking into Thomas's warm cabin shattered that resignation. It proved that suffering wasn't that inevitable. It was a design failure that could be solved. By February 1953, 5 families had approached Thomas asking for help. They wanted shells built around their existing cabins. Thomas wasn't a professional builder, but he understood his design inside and out. He drew plans, calculated materials, explained the principles. By spring, 3 shells were under construction. By the following winter, 7 families in the region were living in shell-wrapped cabins. The results were consistent across all of them. Wood consumption dropped by 45 to 60%. Interior temperatures increased by 12 to 20 degrees. Cold spots disappeared. Families stopped suffering through winter and started living comfortably. Benjamin Driscoll, the master builder who'd called the shell the dumbest thing he'd ever seen, became Thomas's most vocal advocate. He modified the design slightly, using double wall construction instead of corrugated steel in some applications, but the principle remained the same. Create a buffer zone, eliminate corners, deflect wind, manage moisture, let physics do the work. By 1955, the technique had spread to 3 mountain valleys. Variations appeared. Some builders used different materials. Some adjusted the curve angle. Some combined the shell concept with other improvements. But they all shared the same foundation: Thomas Brennan's recognition that traditional cabin design was fighting against heat behavior instead of working with it. The long-term data proved even more impressive than the first winter. Cabins wrapped in shells showed dramatically reduced wood rot because the outer barrier kept moisture away from the log walls. Structural longevity increased. Maintenance requirements dropped, and families living in shelled cabins reported significantly fewer respiratory illnesses, likely due to cleaner burning fires and reduced smoke infiltration. The shell design did more than keep people warm. It kept them healthier. In 1958, a graduate student from the University of Idaho traveled to Bonner County to document what locals called the Brennan Shell Method. His thesis included detailed measurements, interviews with families, and thermal performance data collected over multiple winters. His conclusion stated that Brennan's innovation reduced heating fuel requirements by an average of 54% while improving interior comfort conditions beyond what traditional construction methods could achieve. The design represents practical application of thermodynamic principles decades ahead of contemporary building science understanding. Thomas Brennan never sought recognition for his innovation. He just wanted to keep his family warm without killing himself hauling firewood, but the design he created out of necessity and observation became a regional building tradition that lasted for decades. Some of the original shells are still standing today, still providing that same thermal performance after 70 years. The cabins inside them remain in excellent condition, protected by that curved barrier that everyone thought was foolish until the numbers proved otherwise. The lesson here isn't complicated. Sometimes the experts are wrong, not because they're stupid, but because they've stopped questioning their assumptions. Benjamin Driscoll had 20 years of successful building experience. His methods worked. They kept families alive. But working and optimal are different standards, and tradition often mistakes one for the other. Thomas Brennan didn't have decades of experience. He had curiosity, observation, and the willingness to test an idea even when everyone said it would fail. He didn't argue with the experts. He built his design and let the winter judge it. When the temperatures dropped and the numbers became undeniable, the experts had the integrity to admit they'd been wrong. That takes character. It takes more character to admit error than to defend it. The Brennan homestead stood until 1982 when the property was sold and eventually subdivided. The shell was dismantled, but the cabin inside was found to be in nearly perfect condition. 70 years of Idaho weather had barely touched the logs because that shell had done its job every single day for 3 decades, keeping wind away, moisture away, cold away, creating a buffer zone that turned a decent cabin into an exceptional one. If this story changed how you think about building and insulation, hit that like button. Subscribe for more forgotten frontier engineering that still outperforms modern methods. And drop a comment. If you were retrofitting a cabin in a cold climate today, would you consider a shell design? What changes would you make to Thomas's original concept? Today, passive house design and building science have rediscovered what Thomas Brennan figured out in 1952. Creating thermal buffer zones, eliminating thermal bridges, managing airflow, using geometry to enhance heat distribution. Modern engineers arrive at these solutions through computer modeling and advanced physics. Thomas arrived at them by thinking carefully about what heat actually does and building a structure that worked with those behaviors instead of against them. The techniques aren't identical. Modern materials and methods have advantages Thomas couldn't access, but the principles are the same. Understand the physics, question the assumptions, test the ideas, trust the data. That's engineering. That's survival. That's how you turn the stupidest shelter anyone's ever seen into the warmest home in 2 mountain valleys.